Thank you, Abby. Thank you, Marcus. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay. Thank you, Rev Hardy, for holding this space for us, and Josiah and Hezri. Hell yeah. That was awesome. Thank you. My deepest appreciation also goes out to my partner, Rachel Miller, for reading and listening and editing this talk, so thank you. So a little confession. I wrote this talk when I should have been grading essays. My fourth form students might laugh a little. I confessed to them the other day that instead of grading their first Uber process paragraphs, I went surfing. What can I say? It's hurricane season on the East Coast, so if you're still waiting on a rewrite grade, it'll be there tomorrow, I promise. The title of this chapel talk is An Ocean Mind. I'm still learning to read. Some of what I will share will sound like an essay. Some of it will sound like poetry. There are 3 poems woven into the talk. 2 appear closer to the end if you're looking for a few landmarks. I think your job tonight is to just listen. Let a few sounds crash into your ears and pay attention to what it feels like, more than what every last syllable means. I hope that sounds possible. Last Thursday, Yale professor Dr. Stephanie Dunson spoke to the 5th form about Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. She described how the novel resists traditional close reading and implored the group to stop fighting with the novel. Instead, pay attention to what it feels like to read Beloved. I wish one of my teachers had suggested that idea to me when I was a younger student. Stop fighting with the novel. Stop fighting when you read. I hope what follows explains how I'm learning to read imaginatively, to float in language. Whether you love to read or you fight to read, I think you'll find some meaning in this talk. I wasn't a reader as a kid. It's a fact that haunts me as an English teacher. I was barely a reader when I was a teenager. I dropped AP English after a month in high school. I just didn't want to do that kind of work yet. I carried this frustration with me into my sophomore year fall Brit Lit exam in college. I spent half of an essay describing how I didn't get John Milton's Paradise Lost. I did manage to write about George Herbert's 17th century poems, Altar and Easter Wings. The text of these poems takes the shape of their titles on the page: a simple altar, a set of wings. I was a studio art major, not an English major, and the visual, sculptural effect of these poems made sense to me. I'm fairly sure Professor Asher, the GPA slasher, took pity on me and my affinity for Herbert. I didn't always read the way I thought I was supposed to. I fought and struggled to find meaning, looking into language in ways that didn't really fit how my brain worked. I certainly didn't know how to value how I felt as I read. I see shadows of myself in my students, you. I see you fight against a text almost every day. This fight undermines so many opportunities to read differently, physically, to find more pleasure in reading, to see and experience reading as art. I don't have a magic way of coaching you all beyond this point of resistance. Instead, I hope that you begin to recognize this sensation when you read. Try to describe it in physical terms and write down what you notice. Located in that moment of resistance is your experience of language and how you encounter that moment, whether you choose to fight or to float, shapes the meaning of that experience. In that moment is an ocean, imagination, and idea. So here's the first poem. Hurricane Irene. Done driving, I checked into this motel and turned on the TV. let it glow in the background. How often growing up did I get home from school and let the same nothing hum fill empty rooms? Home needed more than just me. The water that swamped livestock, leveled towns, and buckled highways was now just neon green weather graphic. The wind bone the grass flat and dull, like the imprint a body leaves on a spring lawn, still muddy. I can't remember a time when I didn't know how to swim. I'm incredibly fortunate. My parents started me as an infant in swim class. Those classes rely on the natural instinct of an infant to both float and to hold their breath underwater. We all share this instinct, this ability to float above the surface and to swim below it for brief periods of time. I like to think of this as our ability to exist in two places, to be more fluid, to imagine. William Carlos Williams writes, "To whom then am I addressed? To the imagination," at the start of his book-length poem, Spring and All. He goes on to complicate this statement. As the poem/manifesto unfolds, the imagination seems like more than one thing. It resists fixing in place. It moves and fluctuates in a given moment. So what Williams means by the imagination feels both totally obvious and just out of reach. Poetry, according to Williams, intends to refine, to clarify, to intensify that eternal moment. No past, no future, just an eternal now. He also admits that what he's attempting might be impossible. There is, he writes, there is a constant barrier between the reader and their consciousness of immediate contact with the world. If there is an ocean, it is here. What does it actually mean to experience a novel or poem physically? In Virginia Woolf's novel, The Waves, when the character Ginny, also a boarding school student, reads, she describes how a purple rim runs round the black edge of the textbook. She's mesmerized by the text in front of her, but cannot, as she says, follow any word through its changes. She fixates on the surface of the text, the luminosity of the book as an object, the way it moves and shimmers, its color vibrating. Confounded by this experience, Ginny laments, "I cannot follow any thought from present to past." You might imagine Ginny blocked, frustrated, and fighting the text in front of her. However, her thinking doesn't necessarily stall. She doesn't daydream or despair like her close friends, Susan and Rhoda. She merely exists in that momentary vibration. A feeling, a physical presence takes over Ginny. She's bound to that unfamiliar glow in front of her. Ginny's natural tendency in the novel is toward movement. In fact, she loathes stillness and sleep, like some of you. What Ginny offers is the idea of another kind of intelligence, one that moves and changes and does not require stillness as a requisite for certainty. To be sure of something may suggest a stability of mind, but this isn't an accurate description of the fluid state of learning. I imagine many of you feel that you have to get it before you can talk about it. I'd suggest imbalance and movement, uncertainty, and a belief in the unknown are better foundations for knowledge production. A few years ago, a teacher gave me a simple poetry prompt. Borrow a line from any poem and write a new poem, beginning and ending with that borrowed line. This prompt was exciting because it seemed to highlight the fluid in-betweenness of a poem. The repeated lines felt less like bookends and more like wave peaks. At the time, I was reading Derek Walcott's Omeros, set primarily in the Caribbean, Omeros is a long poem which very loosely retells the story of Homer's Iliad. Chapter 9 in Book 1 begins like this: Hector wasn't with Helen, he was with the sea. During this moment in the poem, Hector tries and fails to rescue his canoe from a hurricane and decides to abandon the boat out beyond the breakwater. Capturing this terrifying and instinctual moment, Walcott writes, "He rode a trough for a while, paddling on his back to measure the right rhythm of the crests, then slid down a slow-gathering wall like a surfer. In the turbulence of the storm, Hector's body measures the chaos of the ocean. He's not battling with the waves. He catches the beat and swims with the crumbling surf. This knowledge of the water, a certain kind of submission or awareness, is more about acceptance. Hector, aware of the limitations of his boat, dives from it before he's injured by its thrashing and foundering, and aware of the limitations of his body, surfs out of the storm. He feels his way back to shore through the currents and breaking swells. Imagine reading like Hector, saving himself from the hurricane." Here's the second poem. Hector wasn't with Helen, he was with the sea. Out far enough to make the land grow thin. His boat is steel and large. He knows the water through vibration. The boat, too big to trim the backs of swell, shudders, flexes through wave crests. Sound moves from hull to boots to legs. There's no lull, no sky in the night, just engine and the promise of return. The promise, bilge-stained and sharp. He returns a winnowed frame, angled, sleep-deprived. At night, she reaches for his skin. She feels each wave crash. Hector wasn't with Helen. He was with the sea. When I think about what it's like to read, I think about that moment between thoughts, between words, and I see an ocean in that moment. That lull between waves isn't static or stable. The space of intake, learning, comprehension is fluid. Like water, how does the body move between two ideas? How does the body move between itself and what it's reading? For me, the body floats between ideas. You can learn to float between ideas. You can let go of the fear of drowning. Your chin tips back, your body follows. Your ears dip below the surface of the water and you hear differently. Distant sounds reach you faster. You're no longer encountering the world through your eyes. Rather, you're aware of your skin, the angle of your hips, your lungs. I'll end with one last poem I've been working on recently. I think it captures a lot of the images that I just talked about. Tropical warning. The days of no boats last a day longer. I drive to the shop, past the ocean, along the ocean road, past the settlement monument and the date inscribed on its face. How many storms have dislodged the marker from its footing on the dune? How many hands have replaced the memory of an erasure? The oyster bags float in the salt pond, and you arrive at this thought like a balm of arnica blooms, a question outsiders trade among themselves, peering from the bluff at two bodies beach napping, their hands entwined, their fingers suspended above the sand in some idea left to those who remember home. Thank you.